Hello, my name is Saulo Padilla. I work for Mennonite Central Committee U.S. as Immigration Education Coordinator. And today we'll be talking about radical hospitality. And it seems that for us to talk about immigration these days, it's a very hot topic, but something that we as Christians should engage and should know about the root causes of why people are coming, and also should know about our immigration system, how the immigration system in the United States is working, and how the language of immigration really affects how we understand immigration. Let's start by talking why people move. People at this point in history are moving for the same reasons that people have moved for a long time in history. The basic needs, famine, poverty, are pushing people from place to place, looking for a better place and for access to basic needs. Also, people looking for safety. War and violence are pushing people outside their homes. One of the biggest issues we have at this point in the United States is many people running away from violence in Latin America, especially in Central America. Many other people are looking for opportunities, the lack of economic opportunities for better jobs. Other people are moving away because of the issue of freedom of expression. This is something that we as Anabaptists and Mennonites should understand well. A lot of our history as Anabaptists and Mennonites is around the issue of running from one place to the other, looking for a safe place so we can worship and that we can have freedom of expression. The exploitation of the environment is another of the issues that at this point is pushing people away from home. One of the things that is really affecting communities in Latin America, but also in other places around the world, is the extraction of minerals, mining. Companies are going into communities and destroying basically the habitats of animals and of people, displacing them, and people are looking then for better places to live. Deforestation is something else that is pushing people away into urban centers. One of the things that we have to take into account as well then, as we are talking about immigration, is the terminology that we use. In the past, we have used terms that are very heroic to talk about people who are on the move. And we have used terms such as settlers, pioneers, colonizers, explorers, pilgrims. Very heroic terminology there. Currently, we're using refugees, asylum seekers. We're looking at immigrants. By using the words immigrants or even then aliens, and then that becomes, if somebody comes here undocumented or without the proper documents, they become illegal aliens. And in some places then we have used very derogatory language as a wetback for those people who are crossing from Mexico and cross through the river and come out wet on the other side. So we have used wetbacks. And then since people are crossing the border without documentation, then a lot of people say, well, that is committing a crime, so then people become criminals. And then since 9/11, immigrants could be terrorists as well. So the things continue, the terms continue to also develop and cause some evolution of the terminology. At this point, if we want to talk about immigrants from an immigration law perspective, we can use unauthorized is one of the terms, an authorized immigrant or migrant, or an unauthorized person who is migrating. We can also use undocumented. That's a little bit more of a activist term that we have been using for people who do not have the proper documents here in the United States. But we also can use irregular migrants, who people who are on migration, but their status is irregular at this point. So that's a term that is used a little more in the United Nations. But we can see how terminology really affects the way that we talk about some people who are on the move. I'm not sure if you can think about what terminology was used when your grandparents moved to the United States or your great-grandparents moved to the United States. What was the terminology being used in the 1800s? What was used in the early 1900s? Or what is currently being used? And how also then put a stigma into what they were doing at that point. So as we are practicing radical hospitality, we have to use a language that humanizes people and also recognizes the God in every person, and also all of us created in the image of God. So now let's talk about immigration and economy. And these are two things that are linked at this point in history, because there is migration at this point is happening mostly due to economics. A lot of people looking for better jobs, looking for opportunities for education, but then also how our free trade agreements or the agreements that we are creating at this point between nations are pushing people away or pulling people into some countries as well. In 1994, the North America Free Trade Agreement was signed. And what that created then was a borderless economy between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. In Mexico, the economy was weaker than it was in the United States and in Canada at the time, and it continues being that way. One of the things that happened at that point is that the United States started injecting the corn economy here with a lot of subsidies. What that did then was, in the same year that NAFTA was signed, in 1994, the price of corn was reduced by about 25%. And then small-scale farmers in Mexico started finding a reduction in their sales in corn, because we were selling corn to Mexico at a cheaper price. Then we started seeing then migration going from places, or from rural places where corn farmers used to farm corn, and for many centuries that's what they did. Then they were being displaced into urban centers. At the same time, the United States then, because of this borderless economy, we started sending our manufacturing into Mexico. So if you cross the border and go into the other side of Mexico, right around the border from Nogales, there's Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. In Nogales, Mexico, you will find these manufacturing places all over along the border. Also, if you cross into Matamoros in Mexico, and in any of the big cities across the border, you will find industrial parks from manufacturing and factories that have moved from the United States into Mexico. It is said that if you want to know where the poor people are at this point in history, you just have to look at the tags in your shirts or in the clothing that you're wearing, because that gives you a little bit of guidance of where we are sending our manufacturing at this point in time because of these free trade agreements. So then what NAFTA then did is sending some of our jobs then south, and also displacing some of the workers in Mexico through the corn. Well, we sent those factories south of the border, and at that point, then these new manufacturing companies started hiring a lot of these farmers who now we had displaced because of the corn agriculture, and they were hired to work in our manufacturing. Those people who could not find a job at these manufacturing places then also heard that the economy in the United States at that point was very strong, and that we were hiring here. So then a lot of people then started crossing the border and coming into the United States. What was also a problem is that a lot of people, when they started crossing, started finding out that there was no legal way of coming to the United States. The system has been broken for many years, so then there was no other legal way to come into the United States, so a lot of them were coming undocumented, either to find a job here or to reunite with family. Well, many of the people have died in the desert in the last 10 years or 15 years. It's being estimated about 5,000 to 6,000 people have died in the desert. One of the other things that has happened then is that many of the manufacturing companies that are here and the farmers here in the United States, because they have to compete now in this new economy of NAFTA, then they start hiring immigrants to work in their manufacturing here in the United States. And that here has created some abrasive relationships between the residents and citizens and immigrants as well, because then we think, well, they are taking our jobs. And these new immigrants are coming here and just taking our jobs, and that is what is happening. But we have heard from business people, from farmers saying, we need this labor and this new economy, and in order to keep up with the market and to keep up with the economy, then we have to hire cheaper labor in some ways. So now we have factories competing with those factories across the border, which are paying here maybe $10 to $20 an hour. Across the border today, the pay rate for a worker in one of those manufacturing places in Mexico is about $5.85 a day. So you can see why there is the need for the United States, in some ways, the manufacturing, to lower the wages here. One of the biggest things that is happening as well then right now is that Canada, with a strong economy, has started to inject some of their economy, and one of them is the tire recycling businesses. And we have found out from some people here in Indiana that the tire recycling businesses in Canada are starting to take over the tire recycling businesses here in Indiana. And I have a friend who was telling me that for him to produce a 1 pound of recycling material in his tire recycling business here, it takes about 8 cents. Canada, because of getting into this business a little bit late, they've been able to provide those 8 cents to their tire recyclers. So then when they inject 8 cents into the tire recycling, they are basically getting rid of all the money to have the material recycled. So at the end, then, those people who are working for recycling are getting all this revenue, and it's actually lowering the price of the cost of the material. So many of the people here in the United States then are starting to buy the materials, the tire recycling material, from Canada and not from the United States. So many people then are trying to compare that with what happened with Mexico. So we took over the corn farming in Mexico, and a lot of the Canadian economy that is in some ways stronger than the United States as well, then is trying to take over some of the things here in the United States, or the manufacturing here in the United States. So you can see how this comes around and creates some relationships between our economies, but also among people as well, and citizens and residents and immigrants. And talking about immigration, we also have to know how economy is affecting the issues of migration, but also have an idea of this umbrella that is the economy that is affecting all of us, citizen, resident, and immigrant. So what do you know about the broken immigration system that the last 4 presidents have been talking about? Let's talk a little bit about immigration history. In the 1800s, in 1880, before the 1882 actually, there was no immigration laws in the United States. The Golden Gate was open to anybody who could come here. It was in 1882 when the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed, and that was the first law that caused some kind of bar for people to come into the United States, and it was exclusively for Chinese people. After that, by the 1920s, was the first time that we created a visa system, where a visa was required to come into the United States and to immigrate to the United States. In 1965, immigration policy changed again, and it became a system where you can only migrate to the United States by issue of a relationship or family relationship with somebody, close family, or by employment. If you had employment here and the access to employment in the United States, then you could come here. So that's the system that is currently in place, and we have not changed it since 1965. So the current structure of the immigration system then, it only provides 4 basic ways of coming to the United States. One is through family, the other one is through employment. We have something called a diversity visa, and the other way to come to the United States is as a refugee or asylum seeker. For the family system, then we only have about 226,000 visas at this point, and that is depending on where you are from. Some countries are capped, and people from Philippines at this point have been waiting for siblings to come here, and the backlogs are probably about 20 to 23 years long. Family reunification is part of this broken immigration system, the lack of access to family reunification. With the employment-based immigration system, then we find 140,000 permanent resident visas every year. And this is primarily for people with extraordinary abilities or the professional status as well. But then for people who do not have these high skills, as we call them, then people who are low skilled or unskilled, then we only have 10,000 visas available. And the problem with that is that many of our farmers are asking for more visas for their workers in the fields. A lot of people in manufacturing are also asking for more visas for people to work with them. For the diversity lottery visas, then, we have 50,000 visas annually, and people who are applying for these must have a high school education or a professional experience to apply. The odds of winning this lottery are, in 2010 were about 1 to 272. So then it is very hard to get into the lottery and to win one of those 50,000 visas as well. And one of the problems too is that there are no visas available for Mexico, the Philippines, India, China, Canada, Haiti, El Salvador, and among other places too, which are probably some of the people that are the source countries of a lot of people who are coming here undocumented, looking and reuniting with their families or looking for a job here in the United States. The issue with many asylum seekers and refugees as well, we have gone from probably a system that used to allow about 70,000 refugees or asylum seekers seeking for refuge in the United States to maybe about 27,000 at this point. And that is since 9/11 that we have reduced the amount of people that we are trying to provide some of that safety as well. That has really changed the way that people are encountering safety and refuge at this point in North America. Current immigration reform proposals do not address or respond to the root causes of immigration, and that's one of the biggest things that I think we should try to propose as we are working on immigration from a Christian perspective. Then how do we understand the movement of people at this point? People like you and I, it's just the same as you and I are created in the image of God and who are lacking some of the safety and some of the family relationships that we have. And then how do we as Christians then can in some ways lobby and ask for reforms that are more humane, that take into account the issues of economics, but also take into account that part that has been created in the image of God in each of us as humans. So I invite you to practice human hospitality in your communities and take into account a lot of these issues, the terminology, the economics, and also this broken immigration system that needs to be reformed in order to provide radical hospitality.